welcome to the deep dive. Today, you and I are going to do something a little different. We're going to try on the hat of a philosopher, not just look at what they argue about, but really dig down into the very nature of their arguments and questions.
That's right. We've got a fascinating collection of ideas here that looks at what happens when philosophers themselves start questioning the status of their own field. It's kind of like a philosopher looking in a mirror and asking, what am I even doing? This area, often called metaphysics or meta-ontology, asks, what kind of questions are metaphysical questions in the first place?
Okay, let's unpack this for you listening. You know those big philosophical questions like, what is real? Or what does it mean to know something? We're not tackling those head on today. Instead, we're going a level deeper. Are these actually legitimate questions? When philosophers disagree about them, are they actually disagreeing about something real, or could something else be going on? And here's where it gets really interesting. Our sources suggest that some of these debates, the ones that have been going on for centuries, might be, wrong in some fundamental way. Maybe the answers aren't wrong, but the very way we frame the questions might be.
What's fascinating here for you as someone who engages with these ideas is the possibility that some seemingly profound disagreements aren't about deep truths about reality, but might be trivial, or, just about how we use language, or maybe not about any facts at all. It really makes you reconsider what philosophical progress even looks like, doesn't it?
Exactly. So our mission today is to explore these different philosophical viewpoints on just how valid and what the true nature is of metaphysical inquiries. We're promised some real aha moments about how philosophers themselves approach their work, and I'm definitely excited to get into it. You ready to dive in with us?
Absolutely. Let's start by highlighting a really crucial distinction for you, one that really sets the stage for a lot of what we'll discuss. It's the difference between being a realist or anti-realist in metaphysics and being a realist or anti-realist about metaphysics.
Okay, lay it on us. This sounds like one of those distinctions that seems simple but has big implications.
Precisely.
Yeah.
When we talk about realism in metaphysics, we're talking about whether certain kinds of things exist. For instance, if you believe that tables, cats, and rocks are real things, you're a realist about composite objects. Makes sense, right? On the other hand, if you think only the most fundamental particles are truly real and everything else is just, a way those particles are arranged, you'd be an anti-realist, perhaps a nihilist, about composite objects. So that's level one, what exists.
Right, so that's the direct question. Are there tables, or are there just atoms wiggling around in a table-like way? Got it.
Now, realism about metaphysics is a different question entirely. It's about the status of the question itself. In our example, are there tables? Someone who is a realist about the composite object question thinks it's a valid, meaningful question that has a real substantive answer about the nature of reality. They think there's a genuine fact of the matter to be discovered.
And the anti-realist about the question, they
Yes.
think what? That asking are there tables is somehow flawed or, misguided.
Exactly. An anti-realist about the composite object question might argue that the question of whether tables exist is trivial, or not really about facts, or that when philosophers debate it, they're just having an argument about words. And here's the kicker for you. You could be someone who totally believes that tables do exist, so you're a realist in metaphysics about tables.
Right.
But at the same time, you might be an anti-realist about the question, are there tables? You might think it's just an obviously true fact that our language and the world work in a way that we call certain arrangements of basic stuff tables.
Whoa. So I could be passionately arguing that tables are real, maybe even slamming my fist on one for emphasis, but deep down I think the whole debate is kind of silly because it just comes down to how we use the word table. That's a real head scratcher.
It is. And the composite object question, are there tables, cats, rocks, serves as a really helpful example for you to keep in mind as we explore these different ways of thinking about philosophical questions themselves. You can strongly believe in the reality of tables while simultaneously thinking the question of their existence, philosophically speaking, isn't a serious metaphysical issue.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the lay of the land. So now let's dive into the specifics of these anti-realist views about metaphysics. Our sources highlight a few main ideas here. First up, trivialism. What's the call of that view?
Trivialism in this context is the idea that a metaphysical question does have an answer, but that answer is so obvious, so utterly trivial that it's hardly worth debating. Think of it like saying all bachelors are unmarried. It's true, but it doesn't tell you anything deep about the world. It's more about the meaning of the word bachelor.
Right.
In the same way, a trivialist about a metaphysical question thinks the answer is just a semantic fact, or maybe a very basic, easily observable empirical fact.
Give us a concrete example to really solidify this for us.
Okay, let's go back to our table example. Trivialist tableism would say that the statement, "there exist tables," is trivially true. Why? Because according to this view, it really just means there are basic fundamental things arranged in a way that we call table-wise. And looking around, it seems pretty obvious, a basic empirical fact, that there are things arranged in ways we call tables.
Okay, I see the trivial part. It's like saying there are unmarried men who have never been married. Technically correct, but not exactly a groundbreaking insight. But what about someone who denies even the existence of these fundamental things arranged table-wise, like those mereological monists who believe the entire universe is just one single indivisible thing?
That's a sharp question. A trivialist might try to get around that by defining basic things arranged table-wise, in a way that even fits with mereological monism. They might argue that if monism is true, then the universe itself in its particular configuration counts as being arranged table-wise, in a very broad sense, of course, just to meet the underlying claim, trivially true by definition. However, for you to really grasp this, remember that the controversial part of trivialism isn't usually about the existence of these most basic building blocks or these stretched definitions. It's the semantic claim that our everyday word table already inherently refers to these arrangements, whatever they might ultimately be.
So the real disagreement isn't about whether the physical stuff is there, but whether our label table accurately and trivially applies to it.
Precisely. Now, our sources highlight several philosophers who have put forward trivialist views on various metaphysical questions. Carnap, way back in 1950, argued that the existence of abstract objects, like numbers, is analytically true within the system of language we use to talk about numbers. It's trivial because the very way we talk about numbers already assumes they exist.
So for you, saying numbers exist is like saying the game of chess has rules. It's true because it's built into the very framework.
That's the essence of his argument, yes. Then we have Thomason, who has applied this trivialist lens to a wide range of things. Not just composite objects, but also abstract objects, and even those tricky coincident objects, like a statue and the lump of clay it's made of. The core idea is that the conditions for correctly using words like table or number are trivially met in many cases.
Interesting. So for her, if there's a collection of atoms arranged in a table-like way, then that already and obviously satisfies what we mean by table, and the question of its existence is therefore trivial.
Exactly. Hirsch offers similar ideas about composite objects, and even the long-standing debate between perdurantism and endurantism, whether objects persist through time by having different temporal parts or by being wholly present at every moment. He suggests these debates are largely just about how we use language, and that ordinary English already trivially favors the existence of composite objects and the idea of endurantism.
Okay, so Hirsch thinks philosophers engaged in these heated debates are actually in quiet agreement about the fundamental facts, but they're just using different philosophical jargon to describe them, leading to the illusion of disagreement. That's quite a claim.
That's the core of his position. Rayo takes a similar approach, arguing that a statement like, "the number of witches is 0, really says the exact same thing as "there are no witches," which makes the existence of the number 0 a trivial consequence of the absence of witches.
Huh.
And by the same token, "there are tables" is just another way of saying there are some things arranged table-wise.
It's like he's suggesting that all the heavy ontological baggage we associate with these questions is just unnecessary linguistic fluff.
Precisely. The source also points you towards a number of other philosophers, such as Schiffer on propositions, Hale and Wright on numbers, Van Fraassen on composite objects, Hofweber with a more nuanced version of trivialism, and potentially Unger and Warren on various topics, all suggesting, in their own ways, that certain metaphysical questions might have trivially true answers once we really understand the meaning of the words we're using.
This is really making you think twice about all those intense philosophical discussions. Okay, so that's trivialism. What's the next flavor of this anti-realism about metaphysics? Mere verbalism. That sounds like those arguments where you eventually realize you've just been arguing about definitions the whole time.
You've hit the nail on the head. Mere verbalism argues that debates about a metaphysical question aren't actually about real disagreements concerning facts about the world, but simply about the different ways people are using words. Our source uses Bennett's clever martini example for you. Jack and Jill argue about whether a vodka apple concoction is a martini, but they completely agree on the ingredients and the type of glass. Their argument only arises because they have different definitions of what martini means.
So they're not actually disagreeing about the drink itself, just about what label to put on it.
Exactly. The source gives a more precise definition of a merely verbal debate for you. It's a disagreement about a statement S, where the two people involved mean different things by S, and in each person's understanding, S is obviously true according to their meaning and obviously false according to the other person's meaning. The obviousness part is key here, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's what separates these kinds of debates from situations where there might be genuine disagreement even when people interpret things differently.
So if Jack thinks a martini obviously has gin in it, and Jill thinks it obviously just needs a V-shaped glass, their disagreement is merely verbal. But if they both agreed that a martini is vodka and vermouth in a V-shaped glass, and then disagreed about whether this specific drink has vermouth, that would be a real, factual disagreement.
Precisely. Now you might think, well, hang on, we all speak English. Shouldn't we mean the same things? But the source introduces this idea of the language of person P, suggesting we should consider the way language is used within a community that's very similar to P. This allows for the possibility that different philosophers, despite using the same surface-level words, might be operating with slightly different underlying languages and implicit definitions.
That makes a lot of sense. Philosophers often develop their own specialized vocabulary, and sometimes those subtle differences in meaning can lead to apparent disagreements that aren't really about the fundamental nature of reality.
Exactly. So how does this relate to metaphysics? Mere verbalism about a metaphysical question argues that there's no nonverbal debate to be had. Any disagreement you see is really just about the meaning of terms or perhaps about which terms we should be using, which would be a conceptual engineering debate rather than a debate about mind-independent reality.
Okay.
This is definitely an anti-realist view because it implies there's no real factual disagreement at the core of these metaphysical issues.
So, for a question like, do past objects still exist? A mere verbalist might say that those who say yes, eternalists, and those who say no, presentists, are just using the word exist or the tense of their sentences in fundamentally different ways.
Exactly. The source mentions the idea of presentese and eternalese. In presentese, the statement, dinosaurs exist, is a present tense claim, which is obviously false. In eternalese, it's a tenseless claim, which is obviously true. A mere verbalist might argue that the entire debate boils down to these different ways of speaking. However, it's important for you to note that simply showing that different languages exist doesn't automatically make someone an anti-realist about the question itself. The anti-realism comes from the stronger claim that there is no underlying nonverbal disagreement.
Okay, so it's not just about different ways of interpreting things, but about the claim that all the apparent disagreement is fundamentally about these linguistic differences. Now, who are some of the big names associated with this idea of mere verbalism?
Well, Carnap pops up again. His views on abstract objects can also be interpreted through a mere verbalist lens. He argued that saying numbers exist is trivially true within the framework of mathematics, but it's not necessarily obviously true in some completely different conceptual framework we could adopt. Hirsch, again with his quantifier variantism, argues that the very meaning of the word exist differs between the languages of, say, someone who believes only in fundamental particles and someone who also believes in composite objects like tables. Putnam, Seidel, Button, Unger, and Warren are also mentioned as holding similar views on questions about composite objects and other areas of ontology.
It seems like the question of composite objects is a frequent target for these kinds of views. It keeps coming up.
It is. Parfit applied this idea to the question of personal identity, suggesting that some of the debates about what makes you the same person over time might really be about how we define the word person. Dennett has hinted at mere verbalist interpretations for some rather unusual metaphysical concepts like sakes and wholes, maybe even for numbers. Sosa is mentioned as someone whose views on composite and coincident objects could potentially be interpreted as mere verbalist, though that's open to debate. Cortens developed a general framework for understanding mere verbalism, though he didn't necessarily endorse it himself. Interestingly, even Hume is mentioned in relation to the free will debate, suggesting that perhaps the core disagreement is about what we actually mean by free will. And then you have Chalmers and Balaguer discussing the incompatibilism debate about free will, with Balaguer later suggesting that questions of conceptual analysis themselves are really about meaning.
Wow.
Finally, Thomason and Bellery see many ontological disputes as fundamentally being about conceptual engineering or metalinguistic negotiations, essentially, about deciding how we should use our terms.
Wow, that's a pretty extensive list of influential thinkers who, in one way or another, have suggested that at least some of our deepest philosophical debates might just be semantic misunderstandings.
Yeah,
It really makes you wonder how much time has been spent arguing past each other.
it certainly does.
Yeah.
And it naturally leads us to the third type of local anti-realism about metaphysics that our sources highlight for you. Non-factualism. What's the central idea behind that?
Non-factualism. Okay, that sounds like the view that there's just no right or wrong answer to the metaphysical question. It's not trivial. It's not just about words. It's just no fact of the matter to be had.
Exactly. It claims that there's no objective truth to be found regarding the answer to a particular metaphysical question. This is different from both trivialism and mere verbalism, both of which suggest that there are obvious answers, at least within certain relevant ways of speaking. Non-factualism, on the other hand, implies that the key languages or conceptual frameworks we might use aren't trivialist in that way.
So for the question, do tables exist? A non-factualist wouldn't say yes, obviously, or it depends on how you define table, but rather there's simply no fact of the matter whether they do or don't.
That's the core of it. The source distinguishes between what it calls non-mere verbalist and mere verbalist forms of non-factualism. Non-mere verbalist non-factualism suggests that there's no fact of the matter because the very sentences we use in the relevant language are too imprecise or indeterminate to have a definite truth value. For example, concerning composite objects, someone might argue that statements like tables exist and tables do not exist both lack a determinate truth value in a substantialist language that requires some, like, extra ingredient beyond just the arrangement of fundamental particles. Balaguer is mentioned as having made arguments along these lines.
This sounds like the idea that our concepts just aren't sharp or well-defined enough to handle these really deep questions about reality, like they just break down.
Precisely. Another argument for this type of non-factualism is that there's simply nothing in the world that determines the truth of the relevant sentences or fixes the reference of the terms we're using. Yablow's work on the philosophy of mathematics is mentioned here, suggesting that whether our numerals actually refer to real numbers might have no bearing on the truth values of mathematical statements containing them, implying there's nothing really grounding that reference.
That's a pretty radical idea that our entire system of mathematical language could be operating without actually pointing to anything real in the world.
It is. Other arguments for non-factualism include the distinction between what are called lightweight and heavyweight uses of the word exists, or the existential quantifier, where it's argued that the heavyweight, ontologically serious sense of exists is actually defective or doesn't function properly, as Chalmers has suggested. There's also the idea that many ontological questions suffer from what's called presupposition failure, as Warren has argued, meaning they assume the existence of deep metaphysical facts that simply aren't there in the first place.
So in that case, the very questions we're asking are flawed from the get-go because they're based on a false assumption.
That's the line of thought. Then we have mere verbalist non-factualism. This arises when there are multiple different ways of speaking, multiple equally relevant languages, which give obvious but different answers to the same metaphysical question. Because no single one of these languages can be shown to be uniquely correct or privileged, there's no objective fact of the matter about which answer is true.
So going back to our time example, if presentese and eternalese are both equally valid and useful ways of talking about time, and they give opposite answers to whether dinosaurs still exist, then there's just no real fact of the matter about whether they do or don't.
Exactly. The idea of these languages being equally relevant could stem from things like inherent indeterminacy in our ordinary language, or the fact that different philosophical languages might be equally coherent, or simply that there's no good reason to prefer one over the other. Many of the philosophers we mentioned earlier as potential mere verbalists, like Carnap, Putnam, Siddell, Button, and Parfit, could also be seen as leaning towards this form of non-factualism in certain areas of metaphysics.
So it's like saying the disagreement isn't about reality itself, and since no particular way of talking about it is definitively better than the others, there's just no objective truth to be had.
That's a good, concise summary for you. Now, of course, all of these anti-realist views about metaphysics haven't gone unchallenged. Philosophers who are realists about metaphysics have raised some pretty significant objections. Where should we begin with those?
Let's start with the objection for metaphysical privilege. That sounds like it directly challenges the idea that all ways of talking are equally valid.
It does. This objection primarily targets mere verbalism, and especially the idea of quantifier variantism, the idea that the meaning of exists can vary between different languages or conceptual schemes. The central argument, championed by philosophers like Sider, is that while there might be different ways to interpret words like exist, one of these interpretations is actually metaphysically privileged.
Privileged how?
This privileged meaning, according to this view, is tied to the idea that the most fundamental terms in our best overall theory of the world carve nature at the joints. They reflect the fundamental structure of reality in a way that other interpretations don't.
So Sider would argue that the way he uses exist in his preferred metaphysical framework isn't just one option among many equally good options. It's one that actually aligns with the deepest structure of how reality is.
Precisely. He sees the existential quantifier, the logical symbol that corresponds to there exists, as a primitive in our most successful theories, suggesting it's a natural, joint-carving expression with a unique and metaphysically significant meaning that can't just be swapped out for another meaning without losing touch with reality itself. Of course, as our source points out for you, those who hold anti-realist views are likely to reject the very idea of these deep metaphysical joints in reality that this whole argument relies on.
Yeah, it feels like a fundamental disagreement at that meta level we talked about earlier, whether there is even such a thing as a single privileged way to accurately talk about reality in the first place. Okay, what's the next big pushback from the realists? The objection from maximalism and the collapse argument sounds pretty dramatic.
This objection also takes aim at mere verbalism. Imagine if a mere verbalist says that the statement, tables exist, is true in one particular language. Let's call it L1. The maximalist argues that if that statement is true in L1, then it follows that tables exist in reality. This directly undermines the mere verbalist claim that there's no real nonverbal fact to the matter about whether tables exist.
Right.
Eklund's point about singular terms, like Herbie is a table, reinforces this. If that sentence is true in L1, then the name Herbie must refer to a real table.
So the realists are essentially saying that if a statement about existence is true in any language that's supposed to be talking about the real world, then that statement has real-world implications that go beyond just the language itself.
Exactly. This line of reasoning often leads to what are called maximalist ontologies, philosophical views that embrace the existence of a surprisingly large number of things. Mereological universalism, the idea that any collection of things, no matter how disparate, forms a whole. Plenitudinous Platonism, the view that all possible abstract objects actually exist. And a plenitude of coincident objects, like the statue and the lump of clay, both being distinct objects occupying the same space.
Whoa, so if saying table can just mean some simples arranged table-wise in one language and that makes tables exist, true, does that mean everything imaginable ends up existing in some sense just by virtue of us being able to define a language where it does? That sounds excessive.
That's the worry that this objection raises. The mere verbalists might try to respond by saying that these existence claims in these maximalist languages are trivially true. For example, numbers exist is true by the very rules of that language, and tables exist just means simples arranged table-wise exist, which they might argue is obviously true.
But the realists would likely push back and say, just because you can define a language where everything trivially exists doesn't mean that's a meaningful or informative way to understand what's actually real.
Precisely. And there are two main problems for the mere verbalists that arise from this. First, it becomes very difficult to provide a coherent account of how the meanings of different words, like simples, tables, and numbers, work together in these maximalist languages if their existence is all just trivially true in different ways. Second, even if you can create these languages, how do you justify the claim that these are the languages that are relevant to our actual metaphysical debates about what truly exists?
It feels like the realist is saying, you can play all the language games you want, but that doesn't change what's fundamentally out there.
That captures the underlying tension well. The source also mentions what's called the collapse argument against quantifier variance, which in essence argues that even if you admit that the meaning of exists can vary, the logical connections between different existence claims might ultimately force them all to be true or all be false, thus undermining the whole idea of genuine variation in meaning. It gets pretty technical.
Okay, the realists are definitely not letting these mere verbalist ideas go unchallenged. What about the objection from analyticity? That sounds like it's directly attacking the trivial part of trivialism.
It is. This objection, which can also be applied to mere verbalism in many cases, argues that trivialists seem committed to saying that certain sentences are analytic, meaning they're true just by definition. For example, a trivialist about tables might have to say that the sentence, if there are simples arranged table-wise, then there are tables, is analytic.
And the objection is that this sentence doesn't seem analytic to most people. Why not?
Bennett has argued that the part after the then, there are tables, seems to have ontological commitments that the part before the then, there are simples arranged table-wise, lacks. Specifically, we usually think of a table as being something numerically distinct from the atoms or particles that make it up. And crucially, you can't just define new objects into existence through language alone.
Right. Just because I define a flump as a creature that eats lost socks doesn't suddenly mean my laundry room is full of flumps. It doesn't work like that.
Exactly the point. Trivialists might try to argue that the first part and the second part of that sentence actually do say the same thing, so it is analytic in some sense. The source mentions Rayo's idea of saying the same thing as being perhaps looser than strict synonymy.
But doesn't that create its own set of problems for you? If the phrase there are means something subtly different when you're talking about fundamental particles versus when you're talking about macroscopic objects like tables, doesn't that mess with how our language normally works?
That's one of the main potential problems. The possible loss of what's called compositionality, where the meaning of a whole sentence is built up in a predictable way for the meanings of its individual parts. If key terms like there are subtly shift meaning, depending on the context, that process becomes much more complicated.
Yeah.
And again, the realist will likely ask, why should we accept your specially defined language, where these connections are analytic, as the one that truly captures the metaphysical reality we're trying to understand?
The idea of the language that matters keeps coming up as a central point of contention.
Hmm?
What about the objection from substantialese? That sounds like an attempt to define a language where the metaphysical questions regain their significance.
Precisely. This objection, which has been developed by philosophers like Balaguer, argues that even if anti-realists can come up with these trivialist languages, where the answers to metaphysical questions seem obvious, we can always define what are called substantialist languages, where the answers to those same questions are not obvious and require a more substantial form of metaphysical inquiry. For example, in substantialist composites, the statement, there are tables, wouldn't just automatically follow from the existence of arranged simples. It would require some extra metaphysical fact about composition to be true. Similarly, you could define substantialist temporalese for questions about time, or substantialist platonese for questions about abstract objects.
So these are essentially languages that are intentionally designed to ask the hard, fundamental questions that metaphysicians are actually interested in. Questions that go beyond just the arrangement of basic stuff or the definitions of our words.
Exactly. The argument here is that these substantialist languages are the ones that really matter for genuine metaphysical inquiry, because they allow us to grapple with the substantive, non-obvious questions that we're trying to answer, unlike the seemingly trivial and uninteresting questions that arise in trivialist languages. Balaguer even argues that even if our natural language as we currently use it is more like a trivialist language, or if metaphysicians have inadvertently fallen into speaking a trivialist language, the substantialist language is still the relevant one for asking the deep questions.
It's like saying, sure, you can define table in a way that makes its existence a trivial consequence of having some atoms in a certain configuration, but that's not the profound question about the fundamental nature of reality that we were trying to ask all along.
Exactly. The anti-realist might counter by saying that these substantialist languages are too vague or ill-defined to even have clear truth conditions. But the realist can then argue back that even if they are somewhat imprecise, they still manage to capture the core of the metaphysical questions in a way that trivialist languages don't.
It seems like we've reached another fundamental disagreement this time about what kind of language is even appropriate for doing serious metaphysics. Now, the problem of the missing second language sounds like a very practical objection specifically aimed at mere verbalism.
It is. This objection points out that for mere verbalism to really work as an explanation for a metaphysical debate, there needs to be a second language where the truth value of the metaphysical claim in question is the opposite of what it is in our language, and that truth value in the second language should also be obvious. But often, it's far from clear what that second language is supposed to be.
Right.
Let's take the example of composite objects again. A trivialist-leaning language might make tables exist trivially true if table just means arranged simples. But what's the corresponding language where tables exist is obviously false?
The language of someone who believes only in fundamental particles, a nihilist about composite objects, perhaps?
Bennett raises a key worry here. If the only way to make tables exist, false in this supposed second language is to define it as meaning something like there are fundamental particles arranged table-wise plus some additional ontologically distinct table entity, then why should that be trivially false? After all, someone who believes in the robust existence of tables would certainly deny that extra entity is required, but would still affirm the existence of tables.
Ah.
This leads to the suspicion that perhaps mere verbalists aren't just saying the debate is about words. They might actually be secretly endorsing a particular anti-realist view in metaphysics in this case. Nihilism about composite objects, rather than just claiming the question of their existence is merely verbal.
So if the only way to make tables exist false in another so-called language is to sneak in the extra contentious premise that tables don't really exist as something over and above the simples, then the whole mere verbalist explanation starts to look a bit suspicious.
That's the worry in a nutshell. Dorr has a similar argument concerning the predicate is a proper part of,
Yeah.
suggesting that it might be semantically defective in the language of ontology, and that analyzing this defect unmasks anti-realists as actually being nihilists in disguise.
Wow.
The general concern is that trivialists and mere verbalists might not just be offering a neutral account of metaphysical debates, they might be implicitly advocating for a specific anti-realist position about the substantive existence of the objects in question.
It feels like the realists are trying to call the anti-realists bluff, saying, you're not just saying the debate is pointless, you actually have a hidden agenda about what doesn't exist.
That's the implication. Finally, we have the problem of metaphysical equivalence. This objection is also directed at mere verbalism, particularly in the context of quantifier variantism.
What's the core of that argument?
It focuses on pairs of seemingly different sentences, one uttered in the language of someone who believes in a rich ontology, like mereological universalism, where almost any collection of things forms a whole, and another uttered in the language of someone with a very sparse ontology, like a nihilist who believes only in fundamental particles.
Mere verbalists often seem committed to the idea that these superficially different sentences are actually metaphysically equivalent. They describe the same underlying reality just using different words.
Right.
For example, there's a table uttered by a universalist might be considered equivalent to "and there are simples arranged table-wise," uttered by a nihilist.
So the mere verbalist thinks these two statements, which seem to describe very different kinds of worlds, are actually saying the same thing at a fundamental level. That's the suggestion. But the objection raised by McSweeney is that these statements don't obviously seem equivalent to most people, and we might lack sufficient justification to believe that they really are equivalent. How can a world that contains tables, in addition to simples, truly be the same as a world that only contains simples arranged in certain ways?
It feels like the realist is saying that the mere verbalist is glossing over a real and significant ontological difference by simply claiming that the two different languages are just talking about the same thing in different ways.
That's the crux of the objection. However, as the source notes for you, once you fully understand the hypothetical languages of universalistes and nihilistes in the specific way the mere verbalist envisions them, the equivalence might seem more plausible. The idea is that the truth makers for the nihilist statement, the existence and arrangement of simples, might be considered sufficient to make the universalist statement true within their own language. The counter-argument then becomes whether we truly do understand and have reason to accept these hypothetical languages as the mere verbalist describes them.
So the realists have definitely laid down some serious challenges, attacking pretty much every aspect of these local anti-realist views. But our sources also discuss broader, more global critiques of metaphysics. Let's delve into those.
Right. While a lot of the recent discussion has focused on these more specific local critiques, there's a longer history of philosophers making more sweeping attacks on the entire project of metaphysics. Think back to the ideas of Wittgenstein and the logical positivists, though those earlier attempts at a global critique often ran into the problem of being self-refuting.
Yeah, that's the classic problem, isn't it?
It is. However, there are more contemporary versions of these broader skeptical views.
Like global anti-metaphysical scientism. What's the main idea there for us?
This viewpoint basically argues that science provides all the genuine understanding of reality that we need, and that metaphysics shouldn't try to go beyond the methods and findings of scientific inquiry. Philosophers like Van Frossen, Maudlin, Ismail, and Ladyman and Ross are associated with this general idea. Ladyman and Ross in particular emphasize the idea that the primary legitimate goal of metaphysics is the unification of our best scientific theories.
So if science doesn't ask a particular question or doesn't have an answer to it, then metaphysics shouldn't be concerned with it either. Is that the idea?
That's the general thrust of it. Then we have the idea of general trivialism about ontological questions, which, as the name suggests, attempts to extend the more localized trivialist ideas we discussed earlier to a much wider range of existence questions. Thomason, for example, argues that many ontological questions are actually quite easily answerable through conceptual analysis or empirical investigation once we're clear on the meanings of the terms involved. Hofweber's framework, with his distinction between internal, not deeply existential, and external, existentially loaded uses of exists, suggests that many existence claims are either trivially true or false, depending on how we're using the word, or are ultimately matters for empirical science to decide.
So for someone like Thomason, asking, do chairs exist, is really just a matter of checking if there are things around that fit our concept of a chair. And for Hofweber, it depends on whether we're asking in a casual, everyday sense or in a more strict philosophical sense.
That captures the core of their views. It's important for you to note that even these more general forms of trivialism usually concede that some questions might still be conceptually or empirically very difficult to answer, and perhaps even that some metaphysical questions might not be trivial in their framework.
So it's not a claim that every single metaphysical question is trivial. And it seems like some of the philosophers we identified as local trivialists and mere verbalists might also be sympathetic to these broader perspectives. What about this neo-positivism that Balaguer puts forward? That sounds like a pretty all-encompassing view.
It is. Balaguer's neo-positivism argues that for any traditional metaphysical question you can think of, one of two things is likely to be true. Either non-mere verbalist non-factualism is the correct view, meaning the question lacks a determinate answer due to the imprecision of our language, or some form of local anti-metaphysical scientism applies, meaning the question is really an empirical one best addressed by science, or that there's been no real philosophical progress made on it.
Wow.
He argues that non-factualism is likely true for questions about things like composite objects and abstract objects, while a scientistic approach is more appropriate for things like conceptual analysis, free will, the mind-brain problem, and the existence of God.
So for just about any of those big classic metaphysical head-scratchers, Balaguer has an argument for why it's either fundamentally meaningless or not really a distinctively philosophical problem in the traditional sense.
That's the gist of his comprehensive view. Now, as we mentioned earlier, a common worry with any global anti-realist view is whether it ends up being self-refuting. Does the view itself undermine its own claims? The source points out that more recent global views, like Thomason's general trivialism and Balaguer's neo-positivism, have attempted to address this. They often argue that their claims are specifically about ontology, this study of being, not about ontological claims themselves, or that they can consistently apply their anti-metaphysical stance even to their own theories.
So Thomason can argue that her view about ontological questions being trivial is not itself a substantial ontological claim. And Balaguer can say that his neo-positivism is just an empirical observation about how metaphysics actually functions.
That's the general strategy they employ. Global anti-metaphysical scientism, however, might face a somewhat tougher challenge in avoiding this kind of self-refutation. How do you scientifically prove that any form of metaphysics that goes beyond science is invalid or meaningless? That claim itself seems to venture beyond the realm of purely scientific findings.
That's a good point. It feels like that claim itself might be a bit, well, philosophical. And then there's the related, just more metaphysics worry. Even if these anti-metaphysical views manage to avoid direct self-refutation, are they just sneaking in more metaphysics under the radar?
General trivialism and neo-positivism can largely sidestep this by acknowledging that they are indeed metaphysical theories of a sort, but claiming that they're not the problematic kind of metaphysics not deeply ontological, or that they can be understood as a form of scientism about metaphysics itself. But again, it's perhaps less clear whether a strong global scientism can easily dismiss this worry.
This has truly been a deep dive into the very foundations of philosophical inquiry. We started by thinking about what it means to act as a philosopher, and ended up questioning the very nature and validity of philosophical questions themselves. It's kind of dizzying.
We certainly have. We've explored for you how anti-realist stances about metaphysics, including trivialism, mere verbalism, and non-factualism, present a significant challenge to the traditional pursuit of deep, substantive answers to fundamental questions about reality.
And we've also seen the strong counter-arguments and objections raised by realists about metaphysics, highlighting the ongoing and incredibly complex debate about the status and ultimate worth of metaphysical inquiry. It feels like for every attempt to deflate the ambitions of metaphysics, there's a robust defense trying to keep those big questions alive.
Absolutely. It leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. Consider a philosophical question that you find truly captivating. After our discussion today, do you think it's possible that the debate surrounding it might be, in some fundamental way, wrong? What would it take for you to personally conclude that such a seemingly profound question might actually be trivial or just a matter of how we happen to use words?
It's a really challenging but also potentially liberating thought, one that really encourages you to reflect critically on the very foundations of philosophical inquiry and the nature of knowledge itself. We encourage you to ponder the implications of these ideas for your own engagement with philosophical debates. It's a whole new level of deep thinking, this diving into metaphysics. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.